evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. It is Thursday, August the 21st. Almost every week since President Trump was sworn in 7 months ago, he has announced that as part of his strategy to rebuild America's industrial base, foreign companies and even countries are pledging significant investments in the United States. According to a recent White House statement, these pledges now exceed a massive $8 trillion, and that's in just 7 months. And since that statement, there's been a $550 billion country-to-country deal announced with Japan. But are these promises leading to real on-the-ground activity in the U.S.? Is it all a show? Are we about to lose our Canadian automotive manufacturing industry? With me today is Andrew Hale, a senior policy analyst in trade policy in Washington's Heritage Foundation. Good evening, Andrew.
Hello, good evening.
Andrew, is this real? When do struggling Americans in the Rust Belt or anywhere actually start getting good jobs out of all this? And is part of the good jobs that they hope to get jobs that are presently in Canada making motor cars?
Well, I think that, it takes literally years to build factories. It can take up to 10 years to build a nuclear reactor. So yes, we do want to make more infrastructure here in the United States. We definitely want to expand manufacturing, but I don't necessarily agree with the approach. I think you could do a lot with deregulation here in the United States. To give you an example, in 1990, we had 57 blast furnaces in which to make steel. We're now down to 11 blast furnaces. And that's largely because it's so difficult to build new blast furnaces given the regulations. And even just last year, the Biden-Harris administration imposed new regulations on the emissions of steel production. And steel production and net zero targets don't mix. So we're actually purchasing 40% of our steel from Canada, our refined steel, because in Canada you have green steel. You're making your steel from nuclear power in Ontario, and of course the steel and aluminium being made in Quebec with hydroelectric power. So again, if we want to compete with that, we'll have to build new nuclear reactors. But of course, that they take about 10 years to build. So I'm afraid it would be better to free up the regulation, have a focus on that, as opposed to a focus on the tariffs.
Yes, well, I actually found an article that you co-wrote with Dr. Stern in the New York Post just last year, and I think you made very much that point, talking about the trade in the United States. And we're talking about the U.S., but obviously we're a Canadian outlet. I think we suffer from some of the same things in this country. And you made the point that economic gains need to come through merit, not be conferred by government favoritism.
Yes.
Do you think that President Trump is actually addressing that? And further on in that same article, you did speak quite positively about tariffs. So Well,
I spoke positively about a border adjustment tax, which is a tariff-like tax. I didn't specifically speak positively about tariffs in general. I was specifically talking about a border adjustment tax, which would be like a GST that you have in Canada.
Okay. You explained that China routinely violates American patents, and foreign countries often restrict U.S. companies. They restrict Canadian companies as well, and use tariffs and subsidies to funnel investments and jobs out of the United States. Well, I think what Mr. Trump is trying to do is reverse that process. But maybe you think otherwise. Where do you and he part company on this?
Well, I was expecting, when President Trump was going to be elected, I was expecting this, which was Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, no trade is free, changing course, taking on China. That's what we were told was going to be the playbook for the Trump administration, number 2, second Trump administration. And Ambassador Lighthizer hasn't returned yet. He didn't, of course, join the first Trump administration at the beginning. There's still time for him to come back. And remember, of course, the USMCA negotiations, or CUSMA, as you'd say in Canada, were going nowhere. So we were expecting a real emphasis on China. I wasn't expecting a tariff war against all of our friends and allies. And I have to, like I said, I think that's because the driving force is not Ambassador Lighthizer in this term, as he was very much in charge of trade policy in President Trump's first term. We have Peter Navarro. And he basically is someone who just doesn't see tariffs as a means to as a negotiating tool, which clearly they are, but he also sees them as a means to pay off the national debt and raise revenue. And I would like to address that, because we have now 37 trillion in national debt in the United States, and you could abolish every government department except the Pentagon and the entitlement programs, and you'd only take off 1 trillion off the national debt, and tariffs are not going to replace, are not going to pay down the national debt. And I would have to address the actual methodology behind this. I think is somewhat flawed. We have to ask ourselves, what was the methodology behind the tariffs against Canada and Mexico, the initial 25% they announced earlier this year, as well as the Liberation Day tariffs in April. They did not actually calculate tariff rates and non-tariff barriers as they said they did. Instead, for every country, they just took our trade deficit with that country of only goods and not services and divided it by the exports to us. And I think it's important to remember that our trade deficit is the flip side of a demand for our assets. So here in the United States, instead of exchanging exported goods for imported goods, we make financial assets. And we all seek foreign investment, but some derive the trade deficits. And to put it a different way, if you have a capital account surplus, you must have an equal and opposite sign current account deficit. And most of our current account involves trades in goods and services. So in other words, we have an investment surplus, and God help us if we lose that, because that's a sign of a very wealthy country that people want to invest in. Also, proportionally speaking, Americans have more purchasing power. We purchase stuff as a wealthy country with wealthy citizens, purchase the world.
So that's okay. Now that's a very degree level analysis, which is what I would expect from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you. But let's bring this back to, first of all, the Canadian auto industry. I mean, the idea, I think, is that if you put tariffs on Canadian manufacture, then eventually it will make more sense. It may be a messy process. It may take a little while, but eventually it's going to make sense for the auto industry to establish itself back in Detroit, back south of the border anyway. Louisville, Kentucky, maybe a lot of them seem to be going there. That's where my car came from. And of course, Canada can't sustain an auto industry on its own market of 40 million people. Now, it's messy, but given time, is that actually a viable strategy on Mr. Trump's part? And should we be, frankly, if we're a Canadian auto worker, looking for something else to do?
Well, I think when President Trump initially told the auto manufacturers in Detroit they had 30 days in which to rejig their supply chains back to the United States, I think that what wasn't understood at the time was the fact that it takes literally years to build factories, and it takes decades to establish, in some cases, supply chain. And remember that on average, in the auto industry, auto parts crisscross the U.S.-Canadian border on average 5 times, sometimes as much as 10 times in the manufacturing process. So we really do need to have no tariffs on intermediate goods to facilitate that process. Already, we've had some bad news in Michigan. They've closed 5 plants already. Stellantis has closed a plant, and Cleveland-Cliffs, the steel manufacturer, has idled one of its blast furnaces. So again, we've had some bad news as a result of this. And this is with most of the tariffs currently being in abeyance. Before they were, this data came through before that we had the full force of the tariffs. So again, I think that as we get more and more bad news going forward. If the tariffs are fully implemented and maintained, we will get a recession. And that will, of course, have an effect on the midterm elections next year. And of course, I think a lot of Republican congressmen and senators are being quite quiet now, hoping that the courts will shut down the use of IEPA, emergency legislation, to implement tariffs. And because they're frightened, they don't want to be primaried right now. So again, but I think the markets will be a moderating force because we have had some bad news.
So, Canadian auto workers, do they have a career to look forward to or not?
I think they do. I think that Canada does need to diversify its trade export markets and not be dependent on a single market like the United States. I would call for that in any situation. I do think Canada is too heavily dependent upon the United States. And remember, Canada does have free trade agreements all around the world. Indeed, I worked on the CETA agreement between Canada and the European Union. so that Canada can take advantage of trade with Europe, Asia, and all around the world, given that, certainly the Harper government and others have, were very activist in promoting free trade and getting comprehensive free trade agreements.
They certainly were. I actually worked for Mr. Harper during those years, and that was pretty much all I was writing for a couple of years, is I was releasing trade agreements. So we were free traders then, we're free traders now, but except that we're not dealing with a free trade United States anymore.
Exactly.
I have to wonder whether, given time, nevertheless, notwithstanding all of the arguments that you've made, the idea of erecting a tariff wall around the United States is actually ultimately going to serve the U.S. well. I wasn't there to listen to the radio broadcast, but we were all taught early on about President Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, talking about America as the arsenal of democracy. I don't think that's true anymore. Certainly that enormous industrial base that enabled the United States to take the war across the Pacific to Japan in 1941, 42, 45, I don't think America could do that today. Do you think it could? Or
whether it could or whether it wants to, I think if you're looking, for example, President Trump certainly has had more of a focus on home, as well as not getting entangled in forever wars abroad. Remember, when in his first term, he didn't want to intervene in Syria, to the anxiety of Prime Minister David Cameron, who's very keen to do so, keeping on the Blair doctrine of humanitarian intervention. I think the United States is pivoting its resources more towards Asia. Ukraine is not in America's backyard, and I don't think it's not electorally, favorable to invest in the war in Ukraine, the billions that the Biden administration invested. I think the United States sees more of investing towards Asia because they see China, the People's Republic of China, as more of a serious threat. And of course, making other countries pay for their own defense. Canada, should spend more on its defense, but not just to appease the United States, so the United States isn't paying for it, but so it can be independently responsible for its own seas, land, and skies, as Stephen Harper recently said. I think that, why should if you look at just one country in Europe, like the Kingdom of Denmark, they have a very, very generous social welfare system, and they were able to have that throughout the Cold War into the present day because they weren't spending money on their own defense. They're relying upon the United States security umbrella. And I think President Trump is right to say, and others, to say it's time for other countries to step up to the plate, because the United States does have $37 trillion in national debt, which is unsustainable, and we can no longer afford to pay for the entire world's security. Nor should we.
Yes. Well, I must say, Andrew, you're speaking to a true believer here, and to a lot of true believers who watch this program. Everybody except our own government thinks that we should have done more and should, in the future, do very much more in terms of our own defense. Promises have been made to spend enormous amounts of money. It's one thing to promise it, it's another thing to actually do it, to A, provide the funds, and B, provide the mechanism to buy the equipment. Canada has a very bad record of doing that. But anyway, that's a slightly different project. I'm just trying to focus on whether this actually makes sense for America, given the time, make the adjustments, bring the industrial base back onto the continent from where it's been. A lot of people will be affected by it, but in the long haul, is this not a good thing to do?
Well, I think like I said, I refer to the former, ambassador of the United States Trade Representative Office, Ambassador Robert Lighthizer, in his book and his focus on China. And I would have thought we would be doing this. I actually believe that these tariffs harm America's global leadership, and it undermines our progress in establishing resilient supply chains in this region and outside China in particular. I think the trade war also has the potential to push our allies into the arms of China. So, for example, if you want to convince the Dutch, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, not to transfer critical chip-making technology to the People's Republic of China, don't tariff all their stuff. And I just think that the approach on Liberation Day, by just announcing these tariffs, I've already mentioned I don't agree with the methodology, but also I just think it was the wrong approach, because we want these countries we want to trade with these countries and have them our allies, be able to influence them away from and decouple and de-risk from the People's Republic of China. And I feel that actually has had a very negative effect. I mean, look, if you look at some very, very hyper protectionist groups like Coalition for Prosperous America, be one of them. And actually, their head of the trade program is actually Canadian. And he said to me, he says, I think Canadians should just buy local and Americans should just buy local. Look, we're not going to build factories here, for example, to make rope. We wouldn't even employ people to do that. We would just automate that. It's best that we purchase rope from India or Africa or somewhere else. We can buy legacy products from other countries. We don't want Americans to work in those factories. And often cases, we wouldn't even employ Americans to work in those factories. We would just automate that. And of course, the unions are opposed to automation. So I just don't think what they're talking about being a sort of totally self-sufficient, United States is possible. What we do want to do is nearshore and friendshore away from the People's Republic of China and trade with our allies and friends like Canada, not tariff them and declare trade wars on them.
Okay, fair enough. Point well made. Now let's turn back to Canada. You've lived in Canada. You have strong Canadian connections. You even went to school here. So you understand the situation very well. You know how we think north of the border. And, of course, you're working for the Heritage Foundation, so you're very au fait with how things are done in Washington. Andrew, if you had 10 minutes with Prime Minister Carney and he were to ask you what you thought Canada should be doing, how we should approach this situation, what would you tell him?
I would say give up the net zero scams. I would say give up all of the ESG and DEI programs. I just feel that there's too many the navel gazing on what I would call luxury beliefs, and net zero targets, manufacturing don't mix. I call it net zero. And I think that's going to be a huge problem going forward between the Trump administration and the current Liberal government in Ottawa. And it's obviously caused friction between the aspirations of provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan and the federal government in Ottawa. I just feel that there is an obsession with net zero targets, and really it's counterproductive. I would say to Prime Minister Carney, look, your windmills, your solar panels are being made in China, and they're building 2 new coal-fired power plants a week, and it's the dirtiest coal in the world. So good luck with that one. That is not helping the environment. So I agree with President Trump when he says, drill, baby, drill. We have vast natural resources here in North America. I believe in, we have this, I believe that the United States should be purchasing Canadian energy as we do. And I believe in a great single market here between, under CUSMA, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And I think that we need to build pipelines as well to export that energy down here in the United States and abroad. Obviously not be totally dependent upon the U.S. market, but also open up markets abroad for Canadian energy. And I know that on the provincial level, there's been a lot of outreach, and that's being done. I've spoken to Danielle Smith. She's doing a great job, as Scott Moe is doing as well in Saskatchewan. I would just simply, I think that would be fallen deaf ears to finish, because, Mark Carney's wife, who's brilliant, she works for the Eurasia Group, as does Gerald Butts. They're brilliant people. But I think this obsession, which is almost like a new religion with these people, on ESG is just really a non-starter for discussions between the United States right now and Canada under the current Trump administration.
Okay, just for the benefit of people who don't keep up with acronyms, I think a lot of people know what ESG is, something that's not good, but environmental social governance, how does that actually interfere with what Canada needs to be doing now to get its house in order?
Well, so with regards to the net zero targets, net zero targets in manufacturing, as I already said, don't mix. They kill industry. Right now, Canada has very, very high energy to a degree, and a much higher, for example, Europe has literally outsourced much of its manufacturing to China. And of course, the energy, the United Kingdom has some of the highest energy in the world now, and it's killing what's left of British industry. I was speaking to an auto manufacturer, parts manufacturer in Northern Ireland, and he showed me his energy bill, and I just was shocked at the compared to the energy prices we pay here in the United States. And so basically, if you want to engage in that ESG, and Mark Carney has even written in one of his books that to achieve these net zero targets and goals and to fully implement ESG and make it a success, we have to become poorer. And there will be losers. I don't agree with him. Like I said, it's not just, it pollutes and poisons everything. So for example, just last year in the United States, we were trying to renew the generalized system of preference, which is a trade preference program for developing countries. And we had the Democrats trying to impose ESG regulations in the renewal of that legislation. Now in India, gender parity requirements perhaps wouldn't work culturally. In Africa, LGBT requirements perhaps wouldn't work culturally either. And the environmental regulations would make this trade preference program so prohibitively expensive for these developing countries, people will just trade with China anyway. So again, I just don't think it's feasible. And quite frankly, I don't actually believe in the climate hysteria either.
Well, I think you're speaking for a lot of people who watch this program, and those are exactly the prescriptions that we we offer here through the Western Standard. Let's get rid of the climate change nonsense. Let's get rid of the ESG, the DEI, and concentrate on doing a good job of what we do best, which is producing energy and exporting it. Andrew, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. The Heritage Foundation, of course, is a really good group. Congratulations on being a member of that. And I want to thank you again for coming on and explaining some of these basic things to us.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.